Hello and welcome to Travelin' Young. We're finally at the episode where we're going to talk about buying a property here in Denmark. And here's the deal. So I recorded a whole bunch already about this subject in the old house. I thought it would be so cool to have this view with the house completely empty and me sitting in the same place where we did all those videos so many times before. But as you can tell, it didn't sound the best. Because this is empty, there's a huge echo. So we're making up for it here in the new house. No old footage, all new footage now. And what we're going to talk about is specifically a house. There's different types of properties that you can get. I don't have any experience in like a co-op condo. Our experience is buying an actual home that we live in. That's a owner-occupied regular house that we live in full-time. And that's what we're going to talk about. And there's four main steps. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare each of these steps from the houses that we purchased in the US to this one here in Denmark. The first step is finding a house. The second step is putting a contract on that house and making an offer. The next step is financing and getting a bank. And in this case, stick around for sure, because I'm going to try my darndest to explain what Course is, which is a very new thing to me that I had to learn because this doesn't exist in America. So Course is going to come up on this as well as we talk about financing and banks. And lastly, the process of taking over the house. So on this week's Travelin' Young, buying a home in Denmark. Okay, before we get started, I want to make a quick programming note, which is to say that on April 25th, next Tuesday, we're going to have a live stream. Yes, we're going to start this concept of having live streams maybe every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, once a month, depends on how well it goes, during the week. And it's going to be at 8 p.m. Danish time. And the idea is that we're going to talk about a certain subject that we might normally do a video about, but instead we're going to do it in a live stream so that you guys can make comments and provide feedback real time, and we can respond to those comments on whatever that topic might be. So you want to make sure to follow us on Facebook or YouTube so you can get notified with the community when I make a post, because I'm going to notify a couple days ahead of time what the topic's going to be. So we'll spend time on a topic, then we're going to have a little pre-recorded Try It On Tuesday. So we're going to bring that back. And then the last part of the live stream, we're going to spend just talking about current events, interesting things that maybe's happened in the past couple weeks that would be interesting for us to talk about, that we all can't stop thinking about or talking about when we go to the water cooler at work. So the idea is the very first topic is next week, we're going to talk about the word foreigner and international and expat and immigrant and all these words. What do they mean? How do we think about them as they affect us since we're living in another country? How those words are used in the US and what they mean there. And we think it's an interesting thing to just debate and talk about. So join us for a live stream the 25th of April and more to come. And make sure to subscribe or follow us on Facebook, where I make announcements on when they'll be and what the topic will be. But moving on, now let's talk about finding a house. That's the first big step in this process. So in Denmark, what we did was we first contacted banks because we wanted to make sure that we could actually get financing. It's not always easy for a non-Dane to get financing at banks. And in Denmark, the process is you do that yourself. So you would contact multiple banks to get offers and have conversations around what's possible or not. We already, on our, announcement video, talked about our experience with those banks. I won't go through that. But we did have a very positive experience in the end with Jyske Bank. And so we contacted them and just kind of ran through things first to ensure the amount of money that we could borrow, the type of house we wanted was all feasible in terms of what we could finance with them. And that was our first step. But then from there, what's super interesting is in Denmark, you actually have to go and arrange to look at houses yourself. There's no buying real estate agents. So we had to look on, on the websites and see what houses were available, contact the agents that were selling for those houses, arrange times to go see those houses. I felt like I was like an ultimate project manager. And what's a little frustrating is nobody shows, you can't look at houses typically on Saturdays, so it's only Sundays or during the week. We could only do it on Sundays. So we had like packed days from like 9 in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon, trying to time it that we can go from place to place because not all of them were in the same town. It was such a scheduling nightmare. Made me appreciate what it was like in the US, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we had to go through this process to basically decide how to find the house that we wanted. And one interesting thing here too is open houses in Denmark are different in the US. In Denmark, the open house is basically just a time that an agent says they'll be there for like 30 minutes. And you still often have to schedule an appointment to even go. So the open house concept is different. I'll talk in a minute about what that's like in the US. So then you also want to start figuring out who a lawyer is going to be. So when you're in a position that you've actually identified the house that you want, you can move quickly because you've already talked to a bank and you've already arranged a lawyer because they're involved in the next step. But before we get there, let's talk about the US and what you would do in this journey of buying a house in the US to start with. So what you would do is actually work with the buying agent and they would help arrange everything for you. So you'd contact an agent and then they basically give them parameters of the type of house you'd be interested in, the neighborhoods you like, and you can look online and recommend houses. They may also find houses. So actually, it's interesting. The second house we bought in the US was in my hometown, and the agent that helped us buy it was an old friend that lived in the neighborhood next to my parents. And she actually knew that her neighbor was moving. And we were able to make a contract and buy that house before it even went on the market. So nobody even knew. If it wasn't for the agent, we would have never even known, or we would have eventually been competing with a whole bunch of other people. But because she knew, we were able to talk to the owners and negotiate and deal with everything without even having to work with other people. They were happy with the price and we moved on. So the buying agent can be super critical because they may have awareness of things that are happening in the market before other people do. So they're super critical, I'd say. And also all that scheduling stuff I talked about before that I had to do in Denmark, well, they do that for you. They'll arrange a whole day of properties to go see. And you can basically almost always go. They have these special locks on the doors that realtors can use to get the key out of this special little lock, the key's in it, and then they can go inside. So it's super easy for a buying agent to take somebody to go see houses in the US. Also, open houses, they're like all day, like 4 hours, and you just show up, and there's usually freshly baked cookies. There were no freshly baked cookies when we went to the open houses in Denmark. So they end up helping you, and then they also, if you want them, help you find a broker, which are the people that help you determine what kind of financing you get. So rather than contacting banks yourself, in the US, a broker will contact multiple banks and give you offers from those banks and help kind of find the right opportunity based on your financing options and your credit history and the amount of money you have. So a broker helps facilitate the financing part rather than you having to go and find a bank yourself. So that's the first most critical step, because you get through that, you've found a house, you know that you can secure some money, and you're ready to go and make an offer. So the next part is making an offer and putting a contract. So in Denmark, because no agent is involved, you actually make that offer directly yourself to the selling agent. So we called up the agent and we said, hey, we really like this house. This is how much we would offer for the house. There's some verbal back and forth to potentially negotiate some things. And that's how the offer is made. And you go through that whole process. And then after that, let's say you go, everybody accepts an offer. Then you get a contract that you would sign. That contract, there's a period of time where you can back out of that contract. And what you want to do in Denmark is they actually do these inspections of houses beforehand. And so you receive an inspection report of regular stuff and electrical that you can review actually even before you make an offer. So you can be aware of what potential issues might be in the house. So you know that ahead of time. Additionally, though, in that period of time after you made an offer, you can have your own inspector come, which we did, to see if how to understand basically how severe the things that are in that report are, but also to see if there's anything else. And that report and all that is super important because there's something later called takeover insurance after you get the house. And that insures you for things that are not identified in the report that you don't know about. But things that you do know about in the report, you're assuming that risk. So that report also provides some protection to the insurance companies for the takeover insurance and what they will and won't cover, and also helps you understand what you're getting into. And then that could be a point of negotiation. You can certainly negotiate any of those things that are on that report or anything else that you've discovered in the inspection that you do if you choose to do one. And that gives you some negotiating points if necessary as part of the final contract before it moves to the point that it's actually been accepted. You also have your lawyer and the bank review the contract to make sure they're okay with it, and then things really start moving. So for us, the next big step after we had the contract in place, we had an inspection, everybody was satisfied, was we had to get the government to approve us for buying a house. Because if you've lived in Denmark for less than 5 years, which we have not yet been here 5 years, we had to ask special permission to buy the home. It was really just a procedure. We provided the contract, we provided information about our jobs, and then the government, it really, I think, took like 3 or 4 weeks, approved us, and then that became like that last contingency that was lifted for us to move forward with buying the house. So the contract, you actually facilitate a whole lot, but you separately hire a lawyer and the bank reviews, and then they help make sure everything's in place moving forward in the contract. In the US, when you negotiate a contract, it's different because in that case, the buying agent that you use and the selling agent, well, they work together and negotiate. You tell your agent what you would like to pay for the house, and then they kind of go back and forth and then call you back and say, oh, this was accepted, or there's this counteroffer. They're kind of the arbiter of that situation for you. So you don't ever really talk to the the selling agent at all. You may never even meet them. And you can get insights from your agent because they may know something about how that other agent usually sells or something about the neighborhood that could help in your negotiation. Or maybe they just know they help somebody buy another house in a similar neighborhood. You should do this, XYZ. So you get some guidance that can help you in the offer process. But they obviously really want you to move forward with the house because that's how they get paid. They only get paid if you actually buy a house. But they're helping you go through this contract. And what happens in the end is you then, in that case, in the US, there is no, at least, now this may be different from place to place, but in Virginia, where we bought a house, in Chicago, where we bought a house, we had to pay for an inspection to happen ourselves. There was no inspection that happened through the public, like what happened in Denmark. And so we had to pay for an inspection, and then that became negotiating points after the contract. And it's very, very common for something in the inspection to turn into something that gets negotiated in the contract. Additional work that maybe needs to be done, like you need to fix this before I'll accept the contract, or maybe you reduce the price because I'd rather pay for those things myself. A little tip for people buying a house, it's better to reduce the price and pay for those things yourself than having a person selling a house pay for things to be done because they will pay for the cheapest way possible. So that's stuff that happens in the contract. In some places like Chicago, there was actually an additional inspection that the city did, and anything they found had to do with code, and that had to be fixed no matter what. There was no choice. That was just a requirement. I think the rules changed a little since we've left, but when we bought our house there, they did their own inspection and they said XYZ had to happen, and the people selling the house had no option. They had to do those things anyway. So that's kind of how it works, and there's a period of time that's defined in the contract for how long you have to basically amend the contract, ask for other things before it's final. But there you go. And the buying agent is helping you kind of through that entire process and giving you guidance. So there you go. At that point, you've got a contract in place, and then you're ready to move on to basically the next stage, which is to make sure that you've got financing. And there's definitely some differences there because in Denmark, there's course. All right, now we're going to talk about financing, and certain parts of this are basically the same. So there's different types of loans. You can get a fixed rate loan where your interest rate doesn't change. That's the same between Denmark and the US. You can get variable rate loans where the rate is fixed for a period of time, then it is variable based on the market changes. That's the same as well. Also in the US and Denmark, you can't borrow more than 80%. And if you borrow more than 80%, you have to get a secondary loan in order to cover the difference because maybe you're not putting 20% down, but 10%. So you need an 80% loan and a 10% loan. And that other loan is usually more expensive in terms of interest rates. That's basically the same. But the massive difference has to do with how the loans are actually structured. So in the US, you get what's called basically one big bank loan. If you need $400,000, you just get $400,000 that you borrow from the bank. There's an interest rate, and the only real components that you mess with there is how much you're putting down and then how much the interest rate is. And you want to get the lowest interest rate possible because that determines how much money you're paying and what your monthly payment's going to be. And that's it. That's like the stuff you mess with. And the interest rate is often based on the market as well as your own credit history and how risky you are perceived, by the banks perceiving you and your risk. So that's the US situation. Start there because it's simpler. Now, the Danish situation is very different, and I'm going to try to. I've been told sometimes I get very detailed and complicate things more. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. But in Denmark, you're not getting a bank loan for that big loan. You're actually, the bank is buying and selling bonds in the market, and that's what's backing the financing for your loan. What this means is you sell bonds for the amount of money that you need to borrow for your house, and then those bonds are what's used to then finance the house and pay for the loan, pay the principal to the people that you bought the house from. And this whole thing is a whole nother system, which actually gives a lot of security to the Danish, mortgage system compared to the U.S. because it's all backed also by bonds in the market, which other banks are buying and selling and stuff. And there's this very important number. So there's the interest rate, which is in the end what you're paying based on how much you borrow that comes from the bonds that you sell, but also the bond rate, which is basically called course. And that course is a number that's almost 100. If you get it to 100, that's awesome because that means that number indicates how much you have to pay when you buy the bonds back that you've sold per krona, or per 100 krona, actually. So if it's a number 100, that means you can buy back, you pay 100 for the 100 krona that you sold it for, which means it's net even and it's not costing you any money in the bond market. And that's very rare to have happen. Otherwise, normally, let's say the number is 98, and that means for every 100 krona that you sold, it costs you 98 to buy back, which means you need to spend a little bit more because 98 isn't 100. There's still 2 krona there. And that gap ends up being something that you actually add to your principal, and that increases your principal at the point where you actually set up your loan, and then that means, based on the interest rate, how much you're paying per month. So what the banks tell you is you want that number to be as close to 100 as you can because that reduces how much of a gap there is, which means you're not borrowing additional money to cover the bond sale. That's all I'm going to say about that. But one thing that's interesting is when you go back and actually buy the bonds later, it's possible that the price of the bonds will be different. By Danish law, it cannot cost you more to buy back the bonds than when you sold them, but it could cost less. And if it costs less, you've actually made money because you've got the money left over on what you sold them for versus what you're buying them back out at. So in this story, it's actually possible in Denmark to make money, not just on selling your house and the value of the house, but also in buying back the bonds when you actually terminate your contract in the end. So there's these two mechanisms, and this is one reason why there's a lot of refinancing happening also in Denmark, even when interest rates are high and low, because this whole bond market puts you in this situation where you can make money when you refinance, and then you can refinance again and get a lower interest rate. And there's like this kind of like roller coaster possibility of making money on your bonds and then changing your interest rates later. So it's super interesting. And that also means you could actually sell your house for less than you bought it for, but make money on bonds and end up making money. Now that doesn't happen often, but it's possible. So this concept of course is very different. I'm still wrapping my head around this, and I'm thinking I might want to do a video with a person in the whole kind of industry to walk us through the very specific details of what this means, because I think it's complicated, but also super interesting because it's very different than anything I've experienced before. And this number is super important. So the course, again, you want it to be as close to 100 as you can to limit the additional principal you add to your loan. And it also can impact if you sell it for less later. So if it's closer to 100 and you sell it for less than that, you can actually make money when you refinance or sell your house in the end just on the bond. All right. So one other thing that's interesting about the US, about the whole financing thing that's super frustrating is in Denmark, you take care of all this kind of stuff. You kind of like work it out, you get everything figured out and you're set. And the bank is happy they've done their work. And there's very little need. And I was nervous, like calling the bank, like, is there anything else I need to worry about? They were fine. In fact, they were even, this is a little different, but the bank in Denmark would be paying off any of the things like my lawyer's fees and the inspection fee and all these things. They were facilitating all that throughout the process of getting to the final kind of deed at the very end. In the US, the banks basically initially talk to you, give you some preliminary stuff. Then they don't talk to you again until like days before closing. And then they're like, give me this, fax me this pay statement, fax me this W-2 tax record. And it's super frustrating because you're like right at the end and you're like, come on. I mean, I had bought 3 houses and still at the end, the last time when I was in the US, by the way, not 3 houses at once, we sold and moved. But when we got to the last house, I was still last minute, even though I had a good credit history, I'd had houses before, faxing them and emailing them all kinds of additional documentation in the last days. It's like they just wait to the end to get the final approval, and it's very stressful as you're trying to kind of like get over the line. But getting over the line now in Denmark and the US is also pretty different because in Denmark, there's special things like I talked about this takeover insurance that you need to figure out, which is something you decide. One thing that's interesting is when in Denmark by law, the person selling the house has to help pay for your takeover insurance. You can pay more because you want something nicer than what they need to give you, but there's like this mutual contribution to this takeover insurance, so you have to work that out. You have to contact your utilities to say, cut it off in my old place, set it up in the new place, all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing is you basically just sign the deed electronically, and then you don't do much else. You get the keys on the day that you agree to get the keys, and a bunch of things are just kind of happening. And then it was like maybe a week and a half later, we got contacted by the bank that said, okay, hey, there was this one little thing that you needed to pay extra because what something costs more than we thought it would. No big deal. I had to pay an extra couple thousand krona. They took it out of my bank account. They gave it to the sellers, and that was it. It was super simple. Now in the U.S. though, as I mentioned, I forgot this. A couple of the last things is you change your address that you register and your CPR number. So then that notifies your credit cards, your banks, everything of your new address. Even your utilities get it so they know where to send the bills, but you need to tell them ahead of time to make sure it starts on the day. And also you tell SCAT, which is the tax authority, so they know, in our case, we'd never owned before, that we get a tax benefit from the interest from our loan. And so we had to tell them how much was the loan, how much interest we're paying. We've moved into a different commune, which changed things. So we notified SCAT all on the day that we moved. That was done. In the US, there's this closing. Now I haven't bought a house since, I guess it was 2010. This may have changed slightly since then, but all the houses I bought up and through 2010, you'd go to this room, you'd meet the people that were selling the house to you, and you'd all sign a bunch of papers. And if you're the buyer, we'd sign literally felt like 100, close to 100, probably like 70 physically signing pieces of paper. And what really stunk about that one is Miranda wasn't there, and I had to sign for myself and for her. And for her, I had to sign like power of attorney, blah, blah, like this sentence every single time. My hand was just like killing me. It was like the most annoying thing. Sign, sign, sign at closing. It's this big day. You spend all this time there. Then at the end, they give you the keys. Although this ceremony is kind of exciting because you go through this whole painful signing thing. Usually an agent gives you like a bottle of champagne or something to celebrate. You get the keys, you walk out. And then you basically have to call everybody yourself. This idea of like having a centralized CPR number that notifies the world of you moving doesn't exist. So you got to call every bank, every credit card, every utility, everybody you can possibly think of to say, I've moved, I need to change my address, this is my new address. It's such a pain to do all of that stuff, but you have to. But in the end, you get to move into your own house. And that's what happens in both cases. In Denmark, we got the keys. We just started moving a week or so later. And there you go. Here we are. This is it. We're in our house. We still haven't hung stuff on the walls yet, though. We did have a fire in the fireplace the other day. It was very exciting. And so we moved here, and there you go. And so that's kind of the last step. But, the takeover process is definitely more convoluted in the US. I was expecting it to be more convoluted here in Denmark, but no, everybody's taking care of stuff. Everybody's getting paid from the bank because you've kind of agreed and given them the power of attorney to do all those things. And then you just kind of show up and get your keys, and the owner left. He walked us through, the seller that is, and he left. And then bam, we had an empty house. And then we shot a video that we talked about it. So there you go. This is the process of our process that we went through, buying a house here, and what it was like for the 3 the townhouse, then a house in Virginia and a house in Chicago as we moved around, different houses that we bought in the US. We're so excited to be homeowners, very excited to be here. If you have interesting parts of your story that you'd like to share with us, please do that and talk about course. If you want to see us make a video where we talk to somebody in the finance industry, explain course in far more detail than I did, let me know because I'm very interested in this. I also like to know where my money's going. So it's definitely one of the reasons I'm also interested in this, but let me know because it's something I'd like to arrange potentially, but I'm curious if you'd like it. Otherwise, if you didn't see our announcement video, go ahead and do that. And the last thing I'm going to say right now is below, I'm going to link to the video that we created with the tour of the house that we used to live in, that we made private at some point because you could kind of tell the house. We don't live there anymore, and we've already told you the address. It's all good now. So I'm going to make it public again and watch that video and see one of the very first videos Traveling Young ever did when we gave our friends and family back home a tour of our house in Lungbu. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. We'll see you later.